listener production.
Hey, welcome to this episode of The Briefing. Sacha Barbour Gatt with you. You might have been hearing the Pope making headlines recently as he battles double pneumonia and what the Vatican is calling mild kidney failure. He's asked Catholics around the world for prayers. But some of us will inevitably be wondering what happens if he does die, or what if he recovers but decides to resign from the papacy. Just like with the British royals when one of their own dies, there's a long list of protocols, sacraments and final rites that have to be carried out in the event a pope passes away. But their succession plan is far more clear-cut than what goes down at the Vatican. So let's explain it. Joining me now is Dr. Miles Pattenden. He's a historian and expert on the Catholic Church from Deakin and Oxford universities. Dr. Pattenden, we know the Pope's health has been deteriorating over the last couple of weeks. His condition is changing minute by minute. Now, the Vatican has been posting regular updates, but given his age, how concerned should we be based off what we've been told?
I think the mood music coming out of Rome is that Catholics are increasingly concerned about what they're hearing from the Vatican. Now, as you've said, the Vatican is very tight-lipped about the Pope's health and exactly what is going on inside the Gemelli Hospital in Rome. But we can infer something from the narrative of what's being presented and sometimes what's not being said. So, for instance, on Sunday's bulletins, one of the most notable things was what wasn't said compared to during the week last week. He wasn't getting up and having breakfast. There were none of these kind of positive signs. And so that's the kind of thing which is starting to lead people to fear for the worst. He has now been in hospital for well over a week, and at least another week is envisaged, even if he should recover. So it is clearly a very serious situation.
Pope Francis, as we're recording this, is still alive. The Vatican, hasn't announced anything along the lines of his death, but people would inevitably be curious now, especially if they're not a member of the Catholic Church, as to what actually happens when a pope dies in the position. How would the public be notified, and what would the immediate first steps be following that event?
Well, there is quite an established procedure for this, which goes back over several centuries. The first thing is that someone has to ascertain that the Pope has died, and there is an official called the Cardinal Chamberlain who does that, who will call out the Pope's birth name. So in Francis's case, that would be Jorge, which was the name he had as a young man in Argentina 88 years ago. And he will call that out 3 times, and if there's no response, then he will pronounce the Pope is dead. He takes the ring off the Pope's finger, which is one of the most important symbols of his authority, and that will be ceremonially broken. And then the Vatican will announce that the death has occurred, probably via bulletins and social media, as they have been doing with the health updates. But the other thing that happens then, which is critical, is that the Chamberlain will seal the Pope's apartments. Everything in the Vatican will be suspended because it is still, in theory, a kind of medieval-style monarchy in which the Pope makes the law, and if there's no Pope, nothing functions. So the Vatican will be sealed off. There'll be a new question this time. Should Francis die in the Gemelli Hospital where he currently is? That's never happened before. So there'll be a question about what to do with the Pope's body, how to move it back to the Vatican, and what they need to do with the hospital facilities as well. But that's everything else is sort of regulated. And then the Pope's funeral has to occur between 4 and 6 days after his death. But between the death and that funeral, the Pope will probably be prepared to lie in state in St. Peter's. There'll be 2 or 3 days in which the Catholic faithful can file past him, pay their respects to him, pray for him. We saw that with Benedict XVI and also with John Paul II in 2005. So then there'll be the funeral, and then at some time after that, there'll be the conclave, which normally starts between 15 and 20 days after the Pope dies. But there were new regulations brought about in 2013 when Benedict XVI resigned. And effectively he said, well, it's up to the cardinals. They can decide that when they want to.
Okay, so it's interesting that you just mentioned the Conclave, because there is actually a movie getting Oscars buzz at the moment, and it's called The Conclave. Have you seen it at all?
I have seen that, yes.
The Pope is dead. The throne is vacant.
The conclave begins now.
We're about to choose the most famous man in the world.
Does it get it pretty close to facts? Can you explain to us like what that succession planning looks like and how it changed after Pope Benedict XVI stepped down?
Well, I think with regard to the rules which I've just described, that movie is very accurate. And for instance, it has a very good depiction of the breaking of the Pope's pontifical ring and of the cardinals going into the conclave. Where it may be less accurate is in the personalities ascribed to the cardinals. There's a lot of dramatic license in it because, it is a really wonderful thriller story. Most cardinals will have started thinking about this already. In fact, they may have started thinking about it 1, 2, 3 years ago. And there is an imperative on cardinals, which actually isn't quite conveyed in that movie Conclave, that they in a world of social media and 24-hour news cycles, they can't take their time over this. I often study medieval conclaves where sometimes the cardinals took 2 years to decide. Well, I don't think that anyone would find that acceptable today. And we saw that with the speed with which they reached their decisions in 2005 and 2013, that they felt that, 2 or 3 days was the appropriate length of time. So, they have to start thinking about it now and working out who is a viable candidate and whom they might vote for. But obviously, it all has to be done very subtly, so that there's no disrespect to the current Pope as he's ailing in the hospital.
Yeah, I'm curious about a succession plan, so to speak, because for most people, understanding the Catholic Church and the intricacies of how it works is very, they don't have that understanding. So is it something where, say, I'm going to make a very poor comparison. Let's say it's the president. You've got the vice president. So the vice president just kind of steps in if something awful would have happened to the president. We know that happens and then there might not be an election for a few years. Is something similar happening within the Catholic Church where there's someone who would step up to kind of take over for the meantime and then they'd bring in, formally announce a new pontiff, or is it completely different?
No, it's completely different to that, partly because as I said, the Catholic Church is in some ways, it's like a medieval monarchy. And the idea is that the Pope's authority comes directly from God. So when the Pope dies, that authority is gone. And the Church has to wait until the cardinals gather in the conclave. And the theory is that the Holy Spirit descends on them and enters into their bodies and their deliberations. And it guides them to picking a new Pope, which has in fact led some people to start worrying about a possible nightmare scenario over the next week or two, in which, say, Pope Francis needs to be put on a ventilator, needs to be put into a coma. What happens then? Because, there is no functional Pope, but there are no arrangements for dealing with that. And again, unlike in the US presidential system, there isn't really a single deputy. There's the Dean of the College of Cardinals, who's sort of the senior cardinal, but he's in fact even older than the Pope. He's 91. So it's not clear that he would be in a position to take over. There's also the Secretary of State, who's the number 2 in the executive branch sense of the Pope, but he's a leading candidate for the next papacy. So it may be that other cardinals don't really want him to step into that role either. So, in those circumstances that, it could get a little bit messy.
Let's say that Pope Francis makes a recovery in this instance and maybe he feels, though, that he can't continue. Would it be controversial for him to stand down? Pope Benedict XVI, who came into power in 2005, was the first in modern history to resign as opposed to die in the role. So would it be controversial if Pope Francis were to follow the same path, or has that already been done and it wouldn't be that big of a deal?
Well, I think it would be a lot less controversial for Francis to resign than it was for Benedict to resign, which, as you've alluded to, was really unprecedented. And we cite these various medieval popes who also resigned, but really their circumstances were nothing like Benedict's, in which he just said, I'm too old and not really capable of carrying this office out anymore. And that was a very brave decision on his part. Now, Francis has at various points said, well, if he also felt that he was unable to fulfill the duties of Pope, he would do the same as Benedict. And in Francis's interpretation, one of the key duties that he has as Pope is to meet the people. So it seems quite likely that even should he recover from this current bout of illness, he'll find it very difficult to move around in crowds and to maintain the active schedule that he did before, which very much raises the question as to whether or not he might decide to resign. But nobody can know whether he'll resign except Francis. The decision is entirely for him alone. But if he does resign, of course, it will set a very powerful precedent for all future popes. If one pope resigns on his own, as Benedict did, then that's sort of an anomaly. But if two successive popes resign, it becomes a pattern which starts to establish a new norm for how the Catholic Church operates and changes its leadership.
I want to bring it to, the Catholic Church broadly. Obviously, its influence right around the globe is immense. How much does the Pope, whoever it is, mean to Catholics around the world, and what sort of outpouring of grief could we expect to see? You mentioned that the Pope would be lying in state for a number of days. What sort of numbers could we expect to travel to the Vatican to see him and to witness that?
The Pope is a hugely important spiritual figure and moral guide for lots of Catholics. Popes are widely loved amongst Catholics all around the world, and we see this with the kind of iconic photographs of Francis that are taken everywhere, the proliferation of merchandise about the Pope. There is a sort of cult of personality around him, as there was particularly over John Paul II. So, it will be a very significant blow to many Catholics for whom he has been a very inspirational figure, especially through the kinds of gestures that he undertook during his pontificate, which often sent a very powerful message of mercy and decency. We think of one from very early on where he let a little boy sit in his papal throne, and another where he embraced a man suffering all kinds of very horrible skin diseases, and he went up to him and hugged him and kissed him. And that's a very powerful image, which I think has had a strong effect on people, and it's why they hold him in great affection. But it is also noticeable that actually the crowds outside the hospital right now are not very substantial. That I remember just about the days and weeks leading up to John Paul II's death, there were a lot more people in Rome for that. It was a lot busier. There were millions of people turned up for his funeral. It may just be that people are less certain what the outcome is going to be, but it may also be that actually Catholics' affection for the Pope in general is not as strong as it was a generation ago. And so we're seeing a slightly more muted reaction to Francis than we did to John Paul.
We know Pope Francis has been one of the most progressive that the Church has ever seen. In fact, probably the most progressive. Do you think the Vatican will look to tread a more conservative path with its future pontiffs, or is it too early to kind of say what direction they might go in?
I think it's too early to say what direction they might go in, but there's certainly precedent for following a liberal pontiff with someone who's a little bit more cautious or conservative. There's a kind of maxim which is said that, when you're electing someone to one of these kind of roles, you look to remedy the defects in the predecessor. But of course, that introduces a whole new set of defects. I think both progressives and conservatives have their frustrations with Francis, and it's easy to characterize. He has often been characterized in the wider media as a kind of liberal figure, but a lot of liberals within the Church would say, well, actually, how many reforms have there been to that? We still don't have any indication that there'll be ordination of women in the Catholic Church, for instance, despite the various things Francis might have said over the years. Likewise, there's been no significant change to policy towards gay people. So there is a sense in which this pontificate promised much, but it hasn't actually delivered all that much in the end. Meanwhile, there are lots of conservatives who are very upset with Francis over his attempts to prohibit them from saying the traditional Latin Mass. And of course, they disagree with him on a wide range of other policies, from his stance on the Ukraine, on Israel-Palestine, on climate change, on migration crises in Europe and America and so on. So like anybody who's exercised global leadership for 12 years, he has lots and lots of critics. And I think a lot of them will start sitting around and thinking, well, how is it that we can move on from some of these frustrations and the policies which we don't think were quite enacted?
It's been a really interesting chat. I want to ask one more question before we wrap up. What do you think Pope Francis's legacy will be when we're looking back in a few years' time?
I think Pope Francis will be remembered as the man who understood how to perform simple acts of kindness and generosity and compassion, and the power that had in an age of social media going around the world. And he has had a strong and positive effect, I think, at that level. And he'll be much missed.
Dr. Miles Pattenden, thank you so much for talking with us today. It's like I said, it's been a really, really interesting chat, so we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
That was Dr. Miles Pattenden speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Before you go, we'd really love it if you could share this app with someone who you think might get something out of it. It's a really easy way you can support us and all we do here at The Briefing, as well as sharing our socials posts. Please go check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We are also on TikTok and on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you tomorrow morning with the headlines.
Listener.